Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 7429 in the name of Angus Robertson on people's right to choose, respecting Scotland's democratic mandate. I would ask those members who wish to speak in the debate, please press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary, to speak to and move the motion. Up to 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every member here in this chamber is here today because of the trust placed in us by the people of Scotland through their votes. Votes that had consequences, votes that, thanks to our system of proportional representation, mattered and allowed people to express their choices. That, Presiding Officer, is what democracy is about, making people's choices matter. Of course, there is more to a modern European democracy than just counting up votes, but when you start to undermine that fundamental, when you seek to deny people what they have voted for, you risk undermining democracy itself. And this places obligations on those of us who win elections. We have to do our best to deliver on the mandates that we are given. But it also obliges us all, when we do not win elections, and very few of us are elected at the first time of asking, to respect the decision of the people, acknowledge the result, and accept the right of the winner to deliver the commitments that they were elected on. Not doing that, denying democracy instead, is a dangerous thing. But it is a thing that people in Scotland are becoming increasingly accustomed to. Presiding Officer, I'm going to focus in today's debate on the outcome of 3 votes, and on the question of how we, those privileged enough to be elected to this, Scotland's national parliament, can best deliver what people in Scotland voted for. And the first of these is Scotland's overwhelming vote in June 2016 to stay in the European Union. 62% of people in Scotland, a majority in every single council area, voted to remain part of the European Union. No part of Scotland voted to leave. Yet 2 years ago, Scotland was removed from the European Union against our will. So this week, instead of celebrating 50 years of EU membership, of cooperation, of multilateralism, of solidarity between nations, of economic development, of peace, we're stuck instead counting the cost of the Tories' reckless Brexit. According to the Office of Budget Responsibility, they estimate that Brexit will reduce long-run productivity by 4% compared with EU membership. This equates to a cut in public revenues in Scotland of around £3 billion every year, heaping further massive pressure on our NHS and other public services. And these statistics are stark, and they mask the human reality of the impact of Brexit. The small businesses going under because of the price of importing, the restaurants and hotels closing rooms and services because they cannot get the staff, the firms passing on to customers their increased costs, helping to fuel record levels of inflation. The academics and scientists no longer involved in world-leading research, unable to get funding to collaborate with peers in the EU, diminishing our ability to innovate, to be at the forefront of discoveries and threatening our world-class standing. The tax revenues that could be used to fund public services, now lost, and the health and social care sectors dealing with a staffing crisis while trying to rebuild from a pandemic. Brexit is harming everyone in Scotland, and there are few reasons to be optimistic. Yes, Presiding Officer, times are tough globally, and every country is suffering from the effects of a pandemic and a global energy crisis. But decades of mismanagement, compounded by the folly of Brexit, have left the UK economy utterly unprepared to weather this storm. European countries comparable to Scotland are wealthier, have lower income inequality in a moment. European countries comparable to Scotland are wealthier, they have lower income inequality, less poverty, higher social mobility, higher and often significantly higher productivity, greater research and development spending and higher business investment than the UK does. The member from the Conservative benches can perhaps explain why.
According to other small independent European nations, perhaps the Minister might tell this Parliament how much it costs to see a GP in Ireland and what the prevailing rate of corporation tax is in Ireland.
Cabinet Secretary.
I note the the member from the Conservative benches could not explain why it is that countries comparable to Scotland are so much better off. They are indeed in a position where they have flimsy arguments for the retention of the United Kingdom. Presiding Officer, it gives me no pleasure, none at all, to point out that people in Scotland's decisions to remain in the EU has been vindicated. And since the Brexit referendum, of course, people in Scotland have voted in every single election for people and parties committed to reversing it. In 2017 and 2019 elections to the Westminster Parliament and in the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections, a majority of MPs and MSPs were elected on mandates to hold an independence referendum so that Scotland could apply to rejoin the EU as an independent member state. Which takes me to the second of the three votes I would like to discuss. An independence referendum was on the ballot paper in May 2021 when this Parliament was elected. Don't take my word for it. Believe the leader of the Scottish Conservatives. Because he said in the run-up to that election, I quote him, "People have to be really clear that a vote for the SNP is a vote for another independence referendum." Believe the leader of the Scottish Labour Party when he said in 2016, and I quote, "Mandates come from the electorate in an election. It should be the people of Scotland who decide when the next referendum is." Believe the SNP and Green manifestos, both of which committed to holding a referendum in the clearest possible terms. And which 72 out of 129 of us here, a clear majority in the Scottish Parliament, were elected to deliver. The parties that said, vote for me and there will be no referendum, they lost. And the parties that said, vote for me and we will give you the choice of independence, won. That simple act of placing one's vote next to a candidate or party that pledged in their manifesto an independence referendum is itself an exercise by people in Scotland of their right to choose their constitutional future, a right that used to be accepted across the political spectrum, a right that the Labour government in Wales accepts. It says, and I quote, Presiding Officer, "The UK is conceived as a voluntary association of nations. It must be open to any of its parts democratically to choose to withdraw from the Union. If this were not so, a nation could conceivably be bound into the UK against its will, a situation both undemocratic and inconsistent with the idea of a union based on shared values and interests." A right, Presiding Officer, that should matter as much to those who oppose independence as to those who support it. Because what is Scotland within the UK if we do not have the right to decide to leave? Trapped, stuck, however we vote. Is that the voluntary union they claim? Which brings me to the third vote I would like to discuss. In 2014, people in Scotland were offered the choice of independence and they voted against it. And we accepted that result. But here is the question that requires an answer.
We're not independent.
After the referendum, did Scotland get what the majority voted for? People in Scotland were promised that within the UK we would benefit from the economic strength of the United Kingdom. Instead, we have suffered from years of economic mismanagement, culminating in the disastrous experiment of a failed Tory budget that cost this country billions and put the final nail in the coffin containing the UK's reputation for economic competence. The OECD predicts that the UK will be the slowest growing G20 nation over the next 2 years, apart from the sanctioned Russia. And perhaps the member from the Conservative benches will explain why the UK is doing so badly in international comparison.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the point of funding choices, I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary thinks it's better to fund the men's shed movement to the tune of £75,000 a year, Or fund £1.5 million annually for the work of 25 civil servants to work on an independence prospectus.
Cabinet Secretary.
Given the opportunity to rise to the challenge and explain why the UK is the worst performing country in international comparison in the G20, the member was unable to do so. It's an embarrassment, and they should take responsibility for it. The latest OECD and IMF forecasts show that the UK is set to have one of the highest inflation rates among G7 nations in 2023. People in Scotland were promised that a no vote would secure Scotland's place in the European Union. Just before the referendum, the then leader of the Scottish Conservatives said in the STV referendum debate, and I quote, "It is disingenuous to say that no means out and yes means in, when actually the opposite is true. No remains we stay in. We are members of the European Union." Oh, really? The then Secretary of State for Scotland said in November 2013, and I quote, "The only guaranteed way of leaving the European Union is to leave the United Kingdom." And the Better Together campaign itself asked the question, what is the process for removing our EU citizenship? Its answer, voting yes. People in Scotland were promised a new era of respect for devolution, and that the UK would operate as a partnership of equals. Instead, we have seen the Westminster Government use its Commons majority to repeatedly overrule the Scottish Parliament in breach of the Sewell Convention. We've seen a series of power grabs through Westminster legislation, changing and limiting this Parliament's powers again and again without our consent. And now we have the UK Secretary of State for Scotland threatening, with a stroke of his pen, to overrule a bill overwhelmingly passed in this Parliament.
Cabinet Secretary, I must ask you to bring your remarks.
Indeed. When the will of a huge majority of elected MSPs in Scotland's Parliament can be reversed by a single figure from the Westminster Government, that shows clearly where sovereignty under the devolution settlement lies. Far from enhancing devolution, giving Scotland more powers and more control, this Westminster Tory government is undermining and systematically dismantling devolution. The motion before us today says that people in Scotland's decisions matter, that their votes count, and their future should be in their hands, because this is about who decides Scotland's future. Is it the 59 MPs from Scotland, or the 591 from the rest of the UK?
Please,
is it the Scottish Parliament or the Secretary of State for Scotland? Is it a Prime Minister from a party that hasn't won an election in Scotland since 1955? Presiding Officer, there is only one answer. The people decide. Democracy demands it. I move the motion in my name.